The propaganda had been explicit in its warnings. Every captured woman would face degradation, violation, a fate considered worse than death itself. These thoughts circled through her mind as the military transport juddered to a halt, dust rising in clouds around the vehicle's worn tires. 22 years old, trained as a nurse in the Imperial Medical Corps, she had never imagined her service would end this way. The metal floor of the truck bed was hot beneath her legs, and through the gaps in the canvas covering, she could see the flat expanse of Texas stretching endlessly toward a horizon that shimmered with heat. Other women sat pressed together on the benches, their faces masks of controlled terror. Each clutched whatever small belongings they had managed to keep through the chaos of surrender and transport. The thin fabric satchels they held seemed pitiful shields against what they had been taught to expect from the enemy. When the canvas flap was pulled back and harsh sunlight flooded the truck bed, she felt her heart accelerate until it seemed to pound against her ribs. This was the moment when their captors would reveal their true nature. She had been instructed by her superiors, warned by the military broadcasts, told in explicit terms what American soldiers would do to captured Japanese women. The propaganda films had shown scenes of chaos and brutality. The radio broadcasts had painted Americans as undisciplined barbarians who saw war as an opportunity for base desires rather than honorable combat. Every fiber of her training told her to prepare for shouting, for rough hands, for the kind of treatment that would strip away dignity and humanity in an instant. But as her eyes adjusted to the glaring light and she climbed down from the truck bed, her prepared response found nothing to attach itself to. The American sentries standing at the compound gates were nothing like the wild-eyed monsters of propaganda posters. They stood at rigid attention, their postures suggesting military discipline rather than predatory intent. Each soldier was tall and well-built in a way that suggested abundant food supplies, their olive-drab uniforms pressed into sharp creases, the fabric unstained by the dust that coated everything else in this place. The rifles they held were positioned upright against their shoulders in perfect uniformity, creating a visual pattern of order rather than threat. Their faces revealed nothing beyond professional detachment, the kind of expression she had seen on senior medical staff during emergency procedures when emotion had to be suppressed in favor of efficiency. An officer separated himself from the formation and approached with measured steps. Beside him walked a smaller figure, a Japanese-American interpreter whose presence added another layer of surreality to the scene. The interpreter's voice, when it came, was sharp but not cruel, carrying the weight of routine instruction rather than malice. Form 2 lines immediately. Maintain silence during processing. Follow all instructions without deviation. The words were delivered in crisp Japanese, each syllable precisely articulated in a way that suggested this speech had been given many times before to many different groups of arrivals. The prisoners obeyed, their movements uncertain, glancing at each other for confirmation that what they were experiencing was real and not some elaborate psychological torture designed to heighten their eventual suffering. She found herself standing in line, her satchel pressed against her stomach like a child's security blanket, scanning the American soldiers for the signs she had been taught to recognize. Where were the leering glances? Where was the crude commentary that military men everywhere supposedly engaged in when presented with vulnerable women? Where was the gloating triumph that victors were expected to display over the defeated? The guards simply stood their posts, their eyes focused on middle distances, their expressions revealing nothing more than mild boredom at performing a routine duty. It was as if the prisoners were cargo to be processed rather than human beings to be dominated or abused. This absence of expected behavior created a vacuum of understanding in her mind, leaving her more disoriented than any amount of cruelty might have done. The intake tent was a large canvas structure that provided blessed shade from the relentless sun. Inside, folding tables had been arranged in efficient rows, and at each station sat an American medic or administrative clerk with paperwork stacked neatly before them. Clipboards, forms, identification cards, medical instruments, all laid out with the precision of a surgical theatre. She approached one station when directed, her legs shaking slightly, and stood while her name was recorded in both English and Japanese script. The clerk who took her information was a young man, perhaps not much older than herself, his hair cut military short, his fingers stained with ink from the stamps he used to mark documents. He asked questions through the interpreter with mechanical efficiency. Full name, age, unit designation, rank, medical conditions. Each answer was noted in careful handwriting, transferred onto multiple forms with carbon paper between them, stamped with official seals that left purple impressions on white paper. Then came the identification tags, thin metal plates stamped with numbers and basic information, hung on chains that would be worn around the neck. She had seen such tags on American prisoners back in Japan, had wondered at the time why they bothered to label people so carefully when death was the expected outcome of capture. Now she was being given one herself, the metal cool against her palm as the chain was placed over her head. It settled against her chest, an alien weight that declared her new status with brutal simplicity. The clerk gestured for her to move to the next station without making eye contact, his attention already shifting to the next woman in line. At the medical station, she encountered something even more unsettling than indifference. The interpreter stood beside a female army nurse, a WAC officer whose uniform included a crisp jacket and skirt rather than the standard men's fatigues. Through the interpreter, the rules were explained with painstaking clarity. Fraternization between American military personnel and prisoners is strictly prohibited. No personal contact beyond official duties is permitted. Any attempt at unauthorized communication will result in disciplinary action for both parties. The Geneva Convention governs all interactions within this facility. Violations will not be tolerated under any circumstances. The interpreter's voice remained level throughout this recitation, neither apologetic nor triumphant, simply delivering information that both sides were expected to understand and obey. The words created a ripple of confusion among the women waiting in line. Whispers began in Japanese, quickly hushed but impossible to completely suppress. Some women exchanged glances that mixed disbelief with cautious hope. Others remained skeptical, convinced this was merely the first stage of a more elaborate cruelty to come. For women who had been taught that capture meant certain violation, being told explicitly that such contact was forbidden by law created a cognitive dissonance that was almost painful in its intensity. The promises of protection ran so counter to everything they had been led to believe about the enemy that accepting them felt like betraying their own country's propaganda machine. The medical examination that followed reinforced this strange new reality. The female nurse conducted the basic health check with brisk efficiency, checking temperature with a glass thermometer, examining visible wounds and bruises from the weeks of captivity and transport, making notes on a medical chart. When male medics were present, they maintained careful distance, speaking only through interpreters, touching patients only when absolutely necessary, and then with gloved hands that suggested medical propriety rather than any personal contact. She watched as one medic wrapped bandages around another prisoner's infected arm wound, his movements quick and impersonal, his eyes focused on the task rather than the person. When he finished, he simply nodded once to the interpreter and moved to the next patient without a backward glance. Sitting on a wooden bench while waiting for her own examination, she observed an American medic approach to treat her sprained wrist. The injury had occurred during transport, a simple accident that had left the joint swollen and tender. The medic knelt beside the bench, pulling on fresh gloves from a box at his belt, and spoke to the interpreter without looking directly at her face. Through translation, he asked about the mechanism of injury, range of motion, level of pain. His hands manipulated her wrist with clinical detachment, checking for broken bones, testing flexibility, wrapping it in supportive bandaging with practiced ease. The entire interaction lasted perhaps 90 seconds, and throughout it all he maintained the kind of professional distance she had seen senior doctors employ when treating patients they wished to remain emotionally detached from. When he finished, he stood, disposed of the gloves in a waste bin, and moved on without any acknowledgement beyond a brief nod toward the interpreter. This wasn't the cold detachment born from contempt or hatred. She had experienced that before, in field hospitals, where wounded enemy soldiers were treated with barely concealed disgust by staff who saw them as monsters rather than patients. This was different. This was the coldness of procedure, the deliberate maintenance of boundaries that existed to protect both parties from complications that might arise from personal connection. It was, she realized with growing astonishment, respect expressed through distance. By refusing to see her as anything other than a medical case to be processed according to regulations, the medic had avoided reducing her to an object of either desire or hatred. She was simply a task to be completed, a form to be filled out, a body to be catalogued and maintained in accordance with international law. At the far end of the tent, mounted prominently where it could not be missed, hung a large sign. The text appeared in 2 columns, English on the left and Japanese on the right, the characters carefully painted in black against a white background. She found herself staring at it, reading the Japanese text multiple times to ensure she understood correctly. No personal contact between United States military personnel and prisoners of war is permitted under any circumstances. All requests, complaints, or communications must be directed through official channels via the camp command structure. Violations of this policy will result in courts-martial for American personnel and disciplinary action for prisoners. This facility operates under the provisions of the Geneva Convention regarding the treatment of prisoners of war. These rules exist for your protection and must be respected by all parties. The sign represented something she had never imagined possible. It declared explicitly that the guards themselves were constrained, that they operated under rules which limited their power over the captives in fundamental ways. Back home, she had seen military authority as absolute, a force that flowed downward from commanders to subordinates to civilians with no checks beyond the personal honor of those who wielded it. The idea that an American soldier might face severe punishment for behavior toward prisoners suggested a system where power was distributed differently, where even the victorious were bound by codes they could not simply ignore when inconvenient. It was not indulgence granted from a position of strength. It was not cruelty restrained by momentary mercy. It was a refusal to cross lines that had been drawn by something larger than individual will, some abstract concept of proper conduct that apparently held real force in this foreign military machine. As she followed the other women through the final processing stations and toward the barracks area, this realization continued to expand in her consciousness. Whatever this place was, however long she would be held here, it was governed by rules that seemed stronger than hatred or desire or triumph, and that truth was more profoundly disorienting than any amount of brutality could have been. Cruelty would have confirmed everything she believed about the enemy. Kindness might have been explained as manipulation or propaganda. But this strict adherence to procedural distance, this refusal to engage as anything other than functionaries performing assigned duties, existed outside the framework she had been given for understanding warfare and captivity. The barracks buildings stood in precise rows behind the inner fence line, simple wooden structures with peaked roofs and high windows that allowed light and air circulation. The design was utilitarian rather than comfortable, clearly constructed for temporary mass housing rather than permanent residence. But there was a tidiness to the arrangement that spoke of planning and maintenance. White paint covered the exterior boards, kept fresh enough to suggest regular upkeep, and the spaces between buildings were carefully measured to allow adequate fire breaks and access for emergency vehicles. Gravel paths connected each structure to the main compound roads, bordered by whitewashed rocks that created clear boundaries between pedestrian areas and the dusty earth beyond. Inside the barracks she was assigned to, the interior revealed more of the same orderly aesthetic. Sunlight slanted through windows set high on the walls, positioned deliberately to provide illumination without allowing visual access to the compound exterior. The light caught particles of dust suspended in the air and created geometric patterns on the wooden floor where planks had been swept clean of debris. Metal-framed bunk beds lined both long walls, arranged with mathematical precision, each identical to the next except for small number plates tacked to the frames. Thin mattresses covered with striped ticking rested on chain-link supports, and each bed had been made up with folded blankets, white sheets tucked in with visible hospital corners, and a single flat pillow in a plain white case. Storage lockers stood at the foot of each lower bunk, simple metal boxes painted olive drab and marked with the same numbering system as the beds themselves. The lockers provided minimal storage space, enough for the sparse belongings a prisoner might accumulate, but not enough for any significant contraband. Additional shelving had been installed along one wall, divided into sections corresponding to each bunk, creating a system where every woman would have designated space for personal items without encroaching on another's territory. Even in captivity, even in defeat, there was an attempt at individual dignity through organization. 2 female interpreters, both WAC volunteers judging from their uniforms, stood near the entrance waiting to explain the barracks regulations. Their presence was itself significant. Male guards had not entered this space, would not enter without specific authorization, and female escort, another boundary maintained. The interpreters handed out standardized items as each woman found her assigned bunk. Prisoner uniforms consisting of simple dresses or work shirts and pants, all in the same drab colour. Towels worn but clean, folded into thirds. A printed sheet containing the daily schedule and compound rules, text presented in parallel columns of English and Japanese, with small diagrams illustrating proper procedures for various activities. She accepted her items and sat on the edge of her assigned bunk, spreading the schedule sheet across her knees to read it carefully. The day was divided into precise blocks of time with designated activities for each period. Breakfast at 0600 hours, served in the mess facility adjacent to the barracks area. Morning roll call at 0700 to be conducted in formation outside the barracks entrance. Work details from 0800 to 1200, assignments to be posted weekly on the compound bulletin board. Lunch at 12:30. Afternoon work or recreation period from 1400 to 1700. Dinner at 1800. Evening period for personal time, letter writing, or approved activities until 2021. Lights out mandatory at 21:30, enforced by barracks monitors and exterior guard patrols. The rules section occupied the back of the sheet, a dense block of text that covered everything from personal hygiene expectations to prohibited behaviors. Unauthorized contact with American military personnel is strictly forbidden. Do not approach the fence line without authorization. Do not attempt to communicate with guards except through designated interpreters. Do not possess or create any materials that could be used as weapons. Do not trade or barter personal items. Do not attempt to leave assigned areas without escort. Do not organize group activities without prior approval from camp administration. Violation of any rule will result in disciplinary measures, including restriction of privileges, isolation, or reduction of rations. Each regulation was numbered and cross-referenced to relevant sections of the Geneva Convention, creating a document that read more like a legal contract than a simple list of camp rules. Around her, the other women were settling into their assigned spaces with varying degrees of comfort. Some unpacked their meagre belongings immediately, as if establishing territory might provide psychological security. Others sat motionless on their bunks, still processing the disconnect between expectation and reality. Whispered conversations began tentatively in Japanese, women testing whether such communication was permitted or would be punished. The interpreters made no move to silence them, simply continued with their orientation briefing, explaining where to find washing facilities, how to submit requests for supplies, when mail call would occur, and what restrictions applied to correspondence. Late afternoon transformed into evening as the women continued their cautious exploration of this new environment. Some ventured to the washing facilities at the end of the barracks, a separate room equipped with sinks, toilets, and shower stalls that provided basic privacy through the use of curtains. The plumbing functioned properly, delivering cool water when taps were turned, draining efficiently into concealed pipes. Soap had been provided in large blocks that could be chipped into smaller pieces, harsh yellow soap that smelled of chemicals but produced adequate lather for cleaning. The towels were rough but absorbent, hanging on hooks labelled with bunk numbers so each woman could identify her designated towel without confusion. She stood at a sink washing her face and hands, the cool water a relief after the heat and dust of the day, and studied her reflection in the small mirror mounted above the basin. Her face looked thinner than she remembered, cheekbones more prominent, eyes shadowed with exhaustion that went deeper than simple lack of sleep. The identification tag hung visible against her collarbone, the metal reflecting light with each breath she took. She was a prisoner now. The mirror made that reality inescapable. Yet she was also, unexpectedly, a prisoner who had been given soap and clean water and a bed with sheets. The complexity of that truth was difficult to process. Dinner arrived precisely at 6 o'clock, wheeled into the barracks area on metal carts pushed by civilian workers wearing kitchen uniforms rather than military fatigues. The meals came on divided metal trays, the kind used in hospitals or schools, with sections for main dish, vegetables, and a piece of bread. The food was plain but substantial. Some kind of meat stew with potatoes and carrots, canned green beans, white bread with margarine, and a tin cup of water. It was more food than she had seen in months, certainly more than she had eaten regularly even before capture. The portions were generous by Japanese standards, sized for American appetites rather than the smaller builds and reduced expectations of Asian prisoners. Guards did not serve the food or interact with the prisoners during the meal. The civilian workers distributed trays and collected them afterward without commentary, performing their duties with the same professional detachment she had seen in the medical staff. The women ate in silence at first, too hungry and too uncertain to make conversation, but gradually the tension began to ease slightly. The food was real, the water was clean. Nobody was being beaten or denied sustenance as punishment for surrender. Each spoonful that went into her mouth contradicted another piece of propaganda about American treatment of captured enemies. One woman near her bunk spilled her water cup in nervousness, the liquid spreading across the wooden floor in a dark stain. The accident produced a moment of frozen panic as the woman waited for punishment, for shouting, for some violent response to her clumsiness. Instead, one of the civilian workers simply brought another cup without comment, setting it on the woman's tray and moving on to continue his rounds. The absence of anger or mockery in response to the mistake was itself remarkable. She watched the interaction carefully, filing it away as another data point in her ongoing attempt to understand this place and these people who had captured her. As darkness fell outside the barracks windows, electric lights flickered on overhead, bare bulbs in simple fixtures that cast harsh illumination across the interior. The interpreters made a final pass through the barracks, reminding everyone of the lights-out policy and answering a few hesitant questions about the next day's schedule. Then they departed, leaving the women alone for the first time since arrival. The door was not locked, there were no bars on the windows, but the fence outside and the guard towers visible through the high windows made clear that this was still very much a prison, regardless of how it might differ from expectations. She lay on her bunk, staring at the underside of the upper mattress, listening to the sounds of other women settling into sleep or into quiet weeping. Some cried silently, mourning their situation or their fears or the families they might never see again. Others breathed with the heavy rhythm of exhausted sleep, bodies finally able to rest after weeks of uncertainty and poor conditions during transport. She found herself caught between these states, too tired to stay awake but too stimulated by the day's revelations to fully surrender to unconsciousness. Through the high windows came the sound of boots on gravel, the steady, measured pace of guard patrols making their rounds. The rhythm was regular as clockwork, suggesting pre-planned routes and timed rotations rather than random wandering. Every so often, a flashlight beam would sweep across the interior walls, visible through the windows, as guards performed cursory checks to ensure order was maintained. But there was no intrusion, no opening of doors for surprise inspections, no harassment of the kind she had been taught to expect from enemy soldiers given power over captive women. The guards remained outside, maintaining their watch from positions that allowed surveillance without violation of the personal space that had been designated as belonging to prisoners. This separation, this deliberate maintenance of distance, even in the darkness when oversight might be less certain, began to work on her consciousness in ways she couldn't quite articulate. The Americans had built walls between themselves and their prisoners, not just physical barriers of wire and wood, but also psychological barriers of regulation and procedure. They had created rules that constrained their own behavior as firmly as the fences constrained prisoner movement. And in doing so, they had produced a kind of safety that existed independent of kindness or cruelty. She was protected not because her captors were good men, but because they were bound by systems that limited what even bad men might do. Sleep came eventually, fitful and interrupted by dreams that mixed memory with recent experience. But when she woke to the sound of morning announcements over the compound loudspeaker system, she found she had slept more deeply than expected. The fear that had accompanied her into this place had not disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something more manageable. She was alive. She was reasonably comfortable, and the anticipated horrors had not materialized during the night. The days began to blend into a pattern that was simultaneously monotonous and reassuring. Each morning brought the same sequence of events: wake-up call over the loudspeakers, a crackling announcement in English followed by a Japanese translation, prisoners rising from bunks and preparing for roll call according to procedures outlined during orientation, formation outside the barracks in neat rows, while an interpreter called names from a clipboard, and each woman responded with her assigned number. American guards standing at careful distances, observing but not participating directly in the count, their weapons held in parade rest position rather than aimed or threatening. After roll call came breakfast, served in a mess hall that accommodated all the female prisoners in the compound. The building was larger than the barracks, with long tables and benches arranged in rows, and a serving line where civilian kitchen staff distributed food onto metal trays. The meals varied slightly from day to day, but maintained consistent quality and quantity. Oatmeal or rice porridge in the mornings, sometimes with canned fruit or a hard-boiled egg. Bread and margarine. Coffee or tea, weak but hot. The women lined up in orderly fashion, accepted their trays, found seats at the long tables, and ate in relative silence while guards maintained positions near the exits, visible but uninvolved. She noticed during these meals how completely the separation was maintained. American military personnel ate in a different facility entirely, their mess hall located on the opposite side of the compound where prisoners were not permitted. The few soldiers who needed to be present in prisoner areas during meal times positioned themselves with backs turned, focusing their attention outward toward potential security concerns rather than inward toward the women they guarded. It was a deliberate turning away, a choice not to observe that went beyond simple indifference. They were choosing not to look, actively averting their gaze in a way that communicated something about boundaries and respect. Work details began after breakfast, assignments posted on a bulletin board near the mess hall entrance. The tasks were mundane but purposeful. Kitchen duty helping civilian workers with food preparation and cleanup. Laundry detail washing uniforms and linens in industrial machines. Garden maintenance tending vegetable plots that would supplement compound food supplies. General compound upkeep sweeping paths. Maintaining barracks cleanliness, simple repairs to facilities. The work was not arduous, certainly nothing compared to the labour conditions she had heard about in prison camps elsewhere, and it provided structure to the long days while also contributing to the maintenance of the facility that housed them. During these work periods, she observed more clearly how the Americans managed interaction between guards and prisoners. Male soldiers never worked directly alongside the women, instead supervising from positions that allowed oversight without close proximity. When instructions needed to be given, they went through interpreters who accompanied work details to translate commands and relay questions or concerns. If a problem arose requiring direct intervention, guards would summon female WAC personnel or civilian supervisors to handle the situation rather than involving themselves personally. The system was cumbersome, requiring extra staff and creating communication delays, but it maintained the boundaries that apparently were considered more important than efficiency. She found herself assigned frequently to kitchen work, her nursing background making her comfortable with the cleanliness standards and organizational requirements of food service. In the large kitchen that fed the entire compound, she helped prepare vegetables for cooking, washed endless stacks of metal trays and utensils, scrubbed surfaces to prevent contamination, and learned to operate industrial equipment under the patient instruction of civilian staff who treated her with neither hostility nor excessive friendliness, just as another worker performing necessary tasks. The civilian workers were older men and women, many of them likely drafted for war service in support roles, and they maintained the same professional distance she had come to expect from everyone connected with this place. One afternoon, while carrying a heavy pot of water, she stumbled slightly and felt hands catch her elbows from behind, steadying her before she could fall. Turning, she found herself looking at an American guard who had been walking past and had instinctively reached out to prevent injury. For a moment their eyes met, his expression startled by his own automatic response, and she saw something human there beneath the trained indifference. But the moment ended as quickly as it had begun. He released her elbows immediately, stepped back with visible discomfort, and gestured sharply for the nearby interpreter to check if she was injured. Through translation, he asked if medical attention was needed, received her negative response, then walked away quickly as if fleeing from a mistake. He had helped her as reflex, human kindness overriding procedure for just an instant, and his swift retreat afterward made clear he understood he had violated the boundaries he was supposed to maintain. That small interaction, lasting no more than a few seconds, revealed more about the camp's functioning than hours of observation had provided. The guards were human beings capable of instinctive compassion. They were not robots or monsters, despite the propaganda of either side. But they had been trained and ordered and threatened with punishment to suppress those human impulses in favor of strict adherence to regulations. The system worked not because the soldiers were cruel, but because they were disciplined, able to override their own natural responses in service of maintaining proper boundaries. And understanding this made her see them differently, not as her enemy in any personal sense, but as men caught in a structure that controlled their behaviour as firmly as the fences controlled hers. Mail became a significant focus of life in the compound. Every 2 weeks, the women were provided with writing materials and allowed to compose letters home under careful supervision. The paper was thin but adequate, distributed in limited quantities to prevent waste. Pencils were provided from a central supply and had to be returned after writing sessions concluded. The letters themselves were subject to censorship, which the interpreters explained carefully and repeatedly. Do not include information about camp location, layout, or security measures. Do not include coded messages or attempt to convey military intelligence. Do not make statements that could be construed as propaganda against Allied forces. Write only about personal matters and your current welfare. Letters violating these guidelines will be destroyed and privileges may be restricted. The first time she sat down with blank paper and pencil, she found herself paralyzed by uncertainty. What could she say that would pass censorship while still conveying truth to her family? How could she describe this place and her treatment in ways that would be believed rather than dismissed as coerced propaganda? After long minutes staring at the empty page, she finally wrote with brutal simplicity, "I am alive and unharmed. The Americans provide food and shelter. We are treated according to international regulations. I think of home constantly and pray you are safe." That was all. A handful of sentences that seemed inadequate to describe the profound transformation her understanding had undergone, but saying more felt impossible given the constraints. Around her, other women struggled with similar challenges. Some wrote optimistic lies, claiming comfort they didn't quite feel in hopes of easing family worries. Others wrote bitter truths about captivity and defeat, expressing shame that cultural conditioning had taught them to feel about survival. A few wrote nothing at all, paralyzed by the difficulty of translating their complex experiences into acceptable words that would survive the censor's review. The interpreter who collected the letters reminded them gently that honest, simple communications were most likely to reach their destinations intact, that attempting to hide messages or express improper sentiment would only result in letters being discarded before they ever left American control. Weeks passed before replies began arriving, letters that had travelled impossible distances through war zones and military postal systems to reach this isolated compound in Texas. The day the first batch arrived, excitement rippled through the barracks in waves. Women crowded around the interpreter who called names from the stack of envelopes, each recipient clutching her letter like a sacred object before retreating to her bunk to read in relative privacy. She received a letter from her mother, the familiar handwriting on the envelope bringing tears to her eyes before she even opened it. Inside, her mother's words were carefully chosen, censored by Japanese authorities just as her own letters had been censored here, but the love underneath was unmistakable. Reading those few sentences from home, she felt something break inside her chest, a knot of tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. Her mother was alive. Her brothers were mentioned briefly, suggesting they were still safe, though possibly in military service. The family home still stood despite shortages and hardships. There were no details about the war's progress, no indication whether Japan was winning or losing, just personal information about daily life and desperate relief that her daughter had survived. "We thought you were dead when your unit stopped reporting. Every day I prayed to hear you lived. Now I know my prayers were answered. Stay strong. Remember your duty. Know you are loved beyond words." That night in the barracks, women who had received letters shared their news in whispers, reading sections aloud to those who had not yet heard from home. Others wept quietly, clutching unopened envelopes as if afraid their contents might not measure up to their hopes. A few sat apart, having received no mail, struggling with the abandonment and fear that no letter might mean families were dead or that they had been disowned for the shame of survival. The interpreters handled this range of emotions with surprising gentleness, offering tissues and privacy to those who needed it while maintaining the professional distance that characterized all interactions in this place. She read her mother's letter multiple times that evening until the words were memorized, tracing her mother's handwriting with one finger and trying to imagine the circumstances under which it had been written. Had her mother been sitting at the low table in their home, using the good ink and brush kept for important correspondence? Had she struggled to find acceptable words just as her daughter had struggled here? The letter provided a connection across vast distance, proof that home still existed beyond this fenced compound, that life continued in ways both familiar and strange while she remained suspended in this state of captivity. Writing replies became easier after receiving that first letter. She no longer felt she was sending words into a void with no certainty they would arrive. Now she wrote with purpose, crafting careful sentences that would pass censorship while still conveying genuine information to her family. She described her daily routine without mentioning guard towers or weapons. She talked about the food and medical care in ways that might reassure without sounding like propaganda. She asked questions about neighbours and relatives, about seasonal festivals and household matters, ordinary concerns that had once seemed trivial but now felt vitally important as anchors to her former life. The letters created a rhythm independent of the camp's physical routine. Mail call became a marker of time, dividing the days into periods of writing, waiting, and receiving. Some women developed extensive correspondence networks, writing not just to immediate family, but to friends, distant relatives, even former teachers or employers who might remember them. Others maintained minimal contact, their letters sparse and infrequent, perhaps finding the process too painful or their lives before capture too disconnected to maintain ties with their current reality. She fell somewhere in the middle, writing regularly to her mother and occasionally to other family members when she had news worth sharing or questions that needed answering. As summer's heat intensified, the camp administration made small modifications to accommodate the climate. Work schedules were adjusted to avoid the hottest part of afternoon, with longer midday breaks and evening work sessions when temperatures became more tolerable. Additional water stations were installed at work sites, with large containers of drinking water available constantly. The guards themselves showed signs of suffering in the heat, their heavy uniforms dark with sweat, but they maintained their posts and patrols without complaint and without seeking to transfer their discomfort onto those they supervised. She noticed during this period how the Americans addressed problems systematically. When several women developed heat exhaustion during garden work, the response was not punishment for weakness, but rather changes to procedures to prevent recurrence. Shade structures were erected over work areas. Rest periods were mandated and enforced. Medical staff monitored workers more frequently, checking for signs of dehydration or overheating. The modifications weren't presented as kindness, but as proper management, maintaining the health of prisoners because regulations required it, because international law demanded it, because allowing preventable illness would be a failure of the system's duty to those in its custody. This practical approach to their welfare sometimes felt more reassuring than overt compassion would have been. Kindness could be withdrawn if circumstances changed or if captors became angry or resentful. But a system, a bureaucracy, an organization built on regulations and procedures that had momentum and structure that transcended individual emotions. The Americans were not treating them well because they felt sorry for Japanese prisoners. They were following protocols that would apply regardless of personal feelings, and that consistency created a foundation of predictability that allowed tension to gradually ease. The barracks itself became more livable as the women learned to adapt the space to their needs within allowable limits. Personal items accumulated slowly, small things acquired through approved channels or created from available materials. Hand-sewn repairs to uniforms that made them fit better. Makeshift containers fashioned from discarded materials to organize the limited belongings each woman possessed. Decorations consisting of dried flowers from the garden work details or simple drawings made during free time. The interpreters permitted these modifications as long as they didn't violate security rules, recognizing perhaps that allowing prisoners some to personalize their environment improved morale and reduced problems. Friendships formed among the women, relationships built on shared experience and proximity. She found herself growing close to several others who had nursing backgrounds, women who understood her training and shared her particular perspective on medical matters. They would sit together during evening free periods, discussing their experiences before capture, speculating about the war's progress, debating the ethics of their current situation. Some argued that accepting American hospitality dishonored their military service and their country. Others maintained that survival itself was a form of resistance, that living through captivity meant they might someday return home with information about the enemy. She listened more than she spoke, still processing her own complicated feelings about what this experience meant. One recurring discussion centered on whether the guards found them attractive and were simply constrained by regulations, or whether American beauty standards were so different that Japanese women held no appeal. The question was simultaneously serious and absurd, mixing cultural insecurity with genuine curiosity about how they were perceived. Some women insisted the guards must struggle daily with prohibited desires, pointing to occasional lingering glances or moments of hesitation as evidence. Others argued the Americans found them completely alien and unappealing, that the professional distance stemmed from indifference rather than disciplined restraint. She tended toward a third interpretation, that the guards probably did experience normal human responses, but had been so thoroughly conditioned by military training and cultural expectations that those responses were genuinely suppressed rather than simply hidden. The question mattered because it influenced how they understood their own safety. If the guards desired them but were restrained only by external rules, then those rules had to remain constantly enforced or disaster might follow. But if the guards genuinely saw them as humans outside the sphere of sexual interest, if the boundaries were maintained by something more than just imposed discipline, then perhaps their safety was more secure. She suspected the truth varied by individual, that some guards were more tempted than others, that the system worked because it didn't rely on any single person's virtue, but rather on collective oversight and consequences for violations. As weeks turned into months, physical changes became noticeable. The women grew healthier on regular rations and adequate medical care, gaining back weight that had been lost during the chaos of war and capture. Skin conditions improved with access to soap and clean water. Wounds and injuries healed properly under medical supervision instead of festering for lack of supplies. She caught her reflection in the washing facility mirror one morning and barely recognized herself. Her face had filled out, color had returned to her cheeks, her eyes looked less haunted despite the ongoing uncertainty of her situation. She was a prisoner, but she was a healthy prisoner, and that biological reality had its own psychological impacts. The compound operated with such regularity that exceptions became memorable events. One afternoon, sirens sounded unexpectedly, sending everyone into confusion and fear. Were they under attack? Was there an emergency? Guards appeared quickly, ushering prisoners indoors with more urgency than usual, their weapons held ready for potential threats. Through interpreters came terse instructions to remain in barracks until further notice, that this was a drill testing emergency procedures, that there was no immediate danger, but everyone must follow protocols exactly. The women huddled inside for 2 hours while whatever exercise was being conducted took place outside their sight, listening to vehicles moving rapidly through the compound and occasional shouted commands in English. When the all clear finally sounded and normal routine resumed, the experience left everyone shaken. The drill had revealed how quickly the professional distance could transform into something more aggressive if circumstances warranted. The guards who had been so carefully detached could become forceful when necessary, moving prisoners with firm hands and raised voices, using their weapons not threateningly, but certainly as visible reminders of who held physical power. Yet even during the drill, no one had been struck or abused. The force applied was minimal and purposeful, just enough to ensure compliance with urgent instructions. And once the situation resolved, the guards returned immediately to their usual distant professionalism, as if the intensity of the previous hours had never occurred. Autumn arrived gradually, bringing cooler temperatures and changing colours to the limited vegetation within compound boundaries. The vegetable gardens produced their harvest, and the women who had worked those plots took pride in contributing to the food supplies, even though it meant improving their own captors' logistics. The work had given them something productive to focus on, a tangible result of their efforts that made the passing time feel less wasted. When vegetables they had planted and tended appeared in the meals served in the mess hall, there was quiet satisfaction mixed with the continuing strangeness of their situation. She found herself thinking differently about the future during this period. Initially, she had expected either rescue by Japanese forces or some terrible fate at American hands. Neither had materialized, and the indefinite nature of captivity forced a different kind of thinking. What if she remained here for years? What if the war ended and she was repatriated only to find Japan defeated and transformed? What would her life be afterward, as a woman who had survived capture when dying was considered more honorable? These questions had no good answers, but confronting them felt necessary, a way of preparing psychologically for unknowable outcomes. Some women began studying English during evening periods, teaching themselves from materials the interpreters provided when requested. The administration apparently saw no harm in prisoners learning their captors' language, perhaps viewing it as a productive use of time that reduced idleness and potential discipline problems. She joined these informal study sessions, finding that learning gave her a sense of agency that captivity otherwise denied. Each word mastered was a small victory, a piece of the enemy's world claimed and made comprehensible. The language was strange, all hard consonants and unpredictable spellings, but gradually it began to make sense. Understanding even simple English changed how she perceived the guards. She could catch fragments of their conversations now, ordinary talk about weather or meals or sports, the mundane discussions of men performing boring duty. They complained about the heat, joked about mail from home, griped about regulations they considered unnecessary. They were not the monolithic enemy of propaganda, but individuals with personalities and opinions, most of them seeming to view guard duty as an unpleasant job assignment rather than an opportunity for power or glory. This humanization was complicated, making it harder to maintain the clear division between us and them that military training had tried to instill. One guard in particular began to stand out from the general uniformity. He was young, perhaps 20 or 21, with reddish hair and freckles that suggested Northern European ancestry. She noticed him because he sometimes paused near the garden area where she worked, not approaching or speaking, but simply present in a way that felt deliberate. His presence was not threatening, more like curiosity held in check by regulations. She wondered what he thought when he looked at the Japanese women tending plants, whether he saw enemies or just people or something more complicated. But the boundaries held, and he never crossed the line into unauthorized contact, always maintaining the proper distance even when his posture suggested he might wish things were different. Attempting once to thank him directly for delivering supplies, she spoke in careful English, words practiced many times privately before using them. "Thank you for assistance." The phrase came out awkwardly, her accent mangling the pronunciation, but the meaning should have been clear. He stopped mid-step, looking directly at her for the first time in weeks, his expression unreadable. For a moment she thought he might respond, might engage in the kind of simple human exchange that happens naturally between people forced into proximity. Instead, he gave a single short nod and walked away without speaking, his shoulders rigid with obvious discomfort at having been addressed personally. The rejection stung more than expected, even though she understood intellectually that he was following rules. There was something painful about having a small gesture of courtesy rebuffed, about being reminded that the relationship between guard and prisoner could never be anything other than what regulations specified. She felt foolish for attempting contact, exposed in a way she hadn't anticipated. The other women who witnessed the exchange said nothing, but their expressions carried sympathy mixed with knowing. They all understood that the walls between captor and captive were not meant to be climbed, that attempting to do so only emphasized one's powerlessness. That evening she wrote in the diary she had begun keeping, using paper acquired through proper channels and carefully hoarding it for private reflections she would never send home. "They do not hate us, but they will not allow us to matter to them as individuals. We are obligations to be maintained according to specifications, no different from equipment or supplies. This rejection hurts more than anger would because it is so absolute. We cannot even provoke a response." Reading the words back to herself, she recognized both accuracy and self-pity in the observation. The guard's indifference was a kind of safety, but it was also a profound invalidation of her humanity, a refusal to acknowledge her as a person worthy of even minimal social reciprocity. Winter approached, bringing with it preparation for colder weather. Additional blankets were distributed to barracks residents, heavier covers that provided adequate warmth even when nighttime temperatures dropped significantly. The civilian workers who maintained compound facilities installed small heaters in the barracks, simple units that produced enough heat to make the buildings tolerable if not entirely comfortable. Prisoners were issued warmer clothing from surplus stocks, sweaters and jackets that had seen better days but still functioned adequately. The administration's response to changing seasons was systematic and adequate, neither generous nor cruel, simply meeting the basic requirements for maintaining prisoner health through winter months. Holiday seasons proved strange and melancholy. Christmas decorations appeared throughout the American sections of the compound, visible from distances but not extended into prisoner areas. The guards seemed more cheerful during this period, their conversations full of references to packages from home and traditions being maintained despite deployment. For the Japanese prisoners, the Western holiday held no personal meaning but still emphasized their separation from home and from the lives they had known. Some women organized simple observances of traditional Japanese festivals, marking seasonal transitions with whatever ceremonies could be managed given available resources. The interpreters permitted these activities as long as they didn't disrupt scheduled routines, seeming to understand the importance of cultural continuity for maintaining morale. She found herself thinking often about the concept of honor during the long winter evenings. Japanese military culture emphasized dying rather than surrendering, portrayed capture as shame worse than death. Yet here she lived, healthy and adequately treated, protected by regulations that prevented abuse, even though they could not prevent the existential crisis of surviving what she had been taught was the ultimate failure. Was she dishonored by accepting food from the enemy, by learning their language, by experiencing relief that the feared atrocities had not occurred? Or was there perhaps a different form of honor in surviving, in maintaining dignity despite powerlessness, in refusing to internalize the enemy's potential contempt or her own culture's condemnation? These questions had no easy answers, and they manifested differently for each woman in the compound. Some maintained rigid defiance, refusing to engage with anything beyond minimum compliance, treating each day as another battle in an ongoing war. Others adapted more readily, finding ways to make peace with their circumstances and even discovering small pleasures in the predictability of routine. She fell somewhere between these extremes, neither fully accepting her situation nor able to maintain constant resistance. She existed in the ambiguous space of survival without resolution, waiting for external events to determine her eventual fate while trying to maintain some core of self that would remain intact regardless of outcome. Spring returned eventually, as seasons always do, bringing warmth and renewed growth to the camp's gardens. The women planted again, repeating cycles they had learned the previous year, their hands more skilled now at the work. She found satisfaction in this repeated pattern, in the tangible evidence that time was passing even though her own life remained suspended. Each plant that sprouted and grew represented movement forward, proof that the world continued turning despite war and captivity. Mail continued to arrive sporadically, letters from home that provided glimpses of ongoing life in Japan. The censorship on both ends meant information remained limited, but reading between careful lines revealed increasing hardship, hints of shortages and fears that grew more pronounced with each letter. Her mother's messages remained optimistic in tone, but the gaps between letters lengthened, suggesting difficulties in the postal system or perhaps worse problems that prevented regular correspondence. She worried constantly about her family's safety, knowing the war must be going poorly for Japan, but unable to get reliable information about specific conditions. The American guards seemed more relaxed as time passed, though they maintained their professional boundaries with consistency that had become habitual rather than consciously effortful. The routines had become deeply embedded, repetition creating patterns that required no thought. Roll call proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Meals were served at exact times. Work details followed established protocols. The predictability was both comforting and numbing, days blending into each other with little variation beyond weather and seasonal changes. She continued learning English, progressing to the point where she could understand much of the basic conversation happening around her, even if speaking remained difficult. This linguistic access provided insight into the guards' perspectives that would have been impossible otherwise. She overheard them discussing war news, debates about Pacific theater developments, speculation about how much longer the conflict might continue. Their information was more current than anything available to prisoners, And while she couldn't trust it completely, the patterns suggested the tide had turned definitively against Japan. This knowledge created its own burden. If Japan was losing, if defeat was inevitable, what did that mean for prisoners held by the victorious side? Would they be eventually released? Repatriated to a devastated homeland? Held indefinitely as bargaining chips in negotiations? Or perhaps forgotten entirely, left in these compounds until administrative inertia or changing circumstances finally resolved their status one way or another? The uncertainty gnawed at her, made worse by the inability to discuss these concerns with anyone who might have actual answers. One afternoon in late spring, something unusual occurred that disrupted the established routine. A group of senior American officers arrived at the compound for what appeared to be an inspection tour. The guards became noticeably more attentive, their uniforms pressed to perfection, their conduct even more rigidly correct than usual. Prisoners were kept in barracks during the visit, presumably to avoid any irregular interactions, but through windows she could observe the inspection party moving through the compound, examining facilities, reviewing documents, engaging in serious discussions with the camp administration. After the officers departed, subtle changes began appearing in compound operations. New regulations were posted addressing issues that apparently had been identified during the inspection. Additional supplies appeared, including better medical equipment and recreational materials, like books and simple games. The mess hall began serving slightly improved meals with more variety. These modifications were minor in themselves, but collectively suggested that higher authorities were reviewing camp conditions and making adjustments. Whether this was due to genuine concern for prisoner welfare or simply bureaucratic optimization of procedures, the result was incremental improvement in their material circumstances. She found these changes both encouraging and unsettling. Encouraging because they suggested the system could respond to problems and attempt solutions. Unsettling because they emphasized how completely her welfare depended on administrative decisions made by people she would never meet, people for whom she was just a data point in reports rather than a human being with specific needs and fears. The improvements were not kindness but management, maintaining assets according to best practices, and recognizing that truth made it hard to feel genuine gratitude even while appreciating better conditions. Summer returned with familiar heat, completing the cycle of seasons she had now witnessed in captivity. The anniversary of her capture passed without ceremony, unmarked except in her own mind, where she noted the passage of time with complicated feelings. A year of survival, a year of waiting, a year of slowly transforming her understanding of enemies and allies, of honor and shame, of what it meant to be human in circumstances that reduced people to categories and functions. The women in her barracks had become something like family, bound by shared experience rather than blood. They knew each other's habits and moods, understood without words when someone needed space or company, negotiated the close quarters with practiced diplomacy born of necessity. Some friendships had deepened into genuine affection, while others remained cordial but distant, temperamental differences magnified by enforced proximity. She had her closer companions and her avoided irritants, a social landscape that developed organically within the artificial constraints of captivity. During evening conversations, speculation about war's end became more frequent and urgent. News filtering through the camp suggested major developments, though specifics remained murky. The guards' demeanor had shifted subtly, some mixture of tension and anticipation that suggested they knew something significant was approaching. Then came the day when all normal activities were suspended, when the women were gathered in the mess hall and an American officer addressed them through the interpreter with news that would change everything once again. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The details would be explained more fully in coming days, but hostilities had ceased, and their status as prisoners of war would begin transitioning toward eventual repatriation. The announcement produced stunned silence rather than jubilation or despair. After so long in limbo, the sudden certainty of change was overwhelming. Japan had lost, their country defeated. Everything they had believed about Japanese supremacy and inevitable victory revealed as propaganda and lies. Yet they were alive. They had survived. And now faced the daunting prospect of returning to a homeland transformed by defeat and occupation. That night in the barracks, reactions varied wildly. Some women wept in relief that the killing had stopped, that whatever came next would be preferable to continued warfare. Others sat in shocked silence, unable to process the magnitude of what defeat meant. A few expressed anger, feeling betrayed by leaders who had assured them victory was certain. She lay on her bunk staring at the ceiling, her mind turning over the revelation and its implications. She would go home eventually. But home was now something different than what she had left, shaped by defeat and occupation in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The days following the announcement brought bureaucratic activity as the camp administration began processing paperwork for eventual repatriation. Medical examinations were conducted to document prisoners' current health status. Identification was verified and recorded. Plans were explained through interpreters regarding the timeline and logistics of return to Japan. The process would take months as transportation was arranged, and occupation authorities established procedures for handling former combatants and military auxiliaries. During this transition period, the relationship between guards and prisoners began to shift subtly. The strict boundaries remained in place, but there was a relaxation of the intensity that had characterized their interactions. Guards occasionally allowed small conversations beyond mere duty-related exchanges, as if the ending of hostilities permitted limited acknowledgement of shared humanity that had been suppressed during active conflict. The change was modest but noticeable. Smiles occasionally exchanged, brief pleasantries spoken through interpreters, a recognition that former enemies might now become something more neutral, if not exactly friendly. She found herself torn between relief and apprehension as repatriation approached. Relief to be going home, to be reunited with whatever remained of her family. Apprehension about what she would find there, how she would be received as a woman who had survived capture, whether the lessons learned in captivity would serve her in a defeated nation struggling to rebuild. The time in the American camp had transformed her understanding of enemies and of her own culture's teachings. She had learned that propaganda distorted truth on all sides, that honor could be found in unexpected forms, that systems of rules could protect even when individuals might fail. When the day finally came for her group to board transport trucks for the first leg of their journey home, she felt surprisingly ambivalent. The camp had been a prison, but it had also been a place of safety governed by rules that, while constraining, had protected her from abuse. The guards she had feared and then adapted to had maintained boundaries that preserved her dignity even in captivity. As the truck pulled away from the compound, she looked back at the barracks and guard towers with complicated emotions. This place had changed her in fundamental ways, reshaping her understanding of herself and her former enemies in ways that would influence the rest of her life. The journey home was long and complicated, involving multiple stops at processing centers where paperwork was reviewed and repatriated. Prisoners were prepared for return to occupied Japan. At each stage, the American military personnel handling the process maintained professional courtesy, treating the returning women with neither hostility nor excessive friendliness, simply as a logistical challenge to be managed efficiently. The pattern was familiar now, recognizable as the same systematic approach that had characterized her time in captivity. When she finally arrived in Japan and saw the devastation that defeat had brought to her homeland, the contrast with her own adequate treatment during captivity became stark and troubling. Cities lay in ruins. Food was desperately scarce. People moved through the streets with haunted expressions, shocked by the magnitude of what had befallen their country. She had been fed regularly while civilians at home starved. She had received medical care while wounded soldiers died for lack of supplies. The realization produced complicated guilt, shame at having survived in comfort while her countrymen suffered, even though her captivity had been beyond her control. Reuniting with her mother was both joyful and painful. They embraced with tears, grateful to have survived, but the questions that hung between them were difficult. Her mother wanted to know about her treatment, whether the rumors of American brutality had been accurate. Telling the truth felt dangerous, like betraying her country again, but she could not maintain the comfortable lies that propaganda preferred. She spoke carefully about the camp, about the rules and routines, about treatment that had been strictly correct, if not warm. Her mother listened with expressions that mixed relief with confusion, clearly struggling to reconcile this account with everything she had been told about the enemy. Rebuilding her life in defeated Japan proved challenging in ways she had not anticipated. Other women who had been captured sometimes faced ostracism, treated as contaminated by their survival and contact with the enemy. She was fortunate that her mother defended her fiercely and that her nursing skills were desperately needed in a country struggling to care for its population. She found work in civilian hospitals, applying her medical training to help with the enormous task of reconstruction. But the experience of captivity stayed with her, influencing her perspective in lasting ways. She had seen that enemies could be disciplined and bound by honor codes, even if those codes differed from Japanese traditions. She had learned that systems of rules could constrain human cruelty more reliably than appeals to personal virtue. She had discovered that survival could coexist with dignity, that living through defeat was not necessarily shameful. These lessons shaped her approach to post-war life, making her more skeptical of propaganda, more willing to question authority, more committed to judging individuals by their actions rather than their national identity. Years later, long after the occupation ended and Japan transformed into a prosperous ally of its former enemies, she sometimes thought about the American guards who had maintained such strict distance during her captivity. She wondered if they understood what their discipline had meant, how their refusal to violate the boundaries between captor and captive had preserved something essential in the women they guarded. That rejection of intimacy, which had felt so painful at the time, had been a form of respect more profound than sympathy or kindness could have provided. They had treated their prisoners as human beings entitled to protection under law, rather than as objects to be exploited or abused, and that systematic decency had made survival possible with dignity intact. She never returned to Texas or sought out anyone from the camp. That chapter of her life remained separate, a transformative experience that shaped her but did not define her. She married eventually, had children, built a career in nursing, and lived into old age watching Japan evolve from devastation to prosperity. But always she carried the memory of those days behind barbed wire, the lessons learned about enemies and honor and the complicated nature of human decency in circumstances designed to bring out the worst in people. The Americans who had guarded her were neither heroes nor villains, but simply humans operating within a system that demanded better behavior than hate or fear might have produced naturally. And that, she concluded late in life, was perhaps the best that could be hoped for from any system designed to manage the inherently dehumanizing reality of warfare and captivity.